Hello! Last class we discussed on how technology has led to productivity increases that completely transformed everyone's lives in the last 300 years. However, when we study comparative growth performances across countries, if technology would be the only source of growth, this would mean that there would be no hope for poor countries to eventually catch up in terms of welfare with richer countries. Technology, with little lag, tends to reach every corner of the planet. The reason why Burundi is poorer than the US is not because people have yet to invent the internet there. Innovations have this property that once occurring, they tend to be easily appropriated by everyone within small periods of time. So there must be other factors that influence economic growth dynamics and which provide a rationale for why countries like Korea and Japan manage to achieve living standards at par with other developed economies, despite starting from comparably much poorer economies prior to the Second World War. This plot shows growth trajectories for 7 advanced economies since the 1870s. We can observe how the US and the UK had relatively stable growth since then. But other economies exhibit much faster growth, especially after the Second World War. Such is the case of Germany, France, and Japan, who experienced a large degree of destruction due to the war. But also other countries such as Korea, who grew much faster and for much longer until it converged in GDP per capita with other advanced economies. Did this happen because Korea, France, Japan, Germany had some technology that the US and the UK didn't know about? Surely that wasn't the case. They grew much faster essentially because they were destroyed with the war. Or, in the case of Korea, they were much poorer societies in the first place. Think about a farmer and a farmer. If the farmer has no tractor, its labor productivity will be rather low, and as such, not likely to experience much in terms of economic growth. But let's imagine that he gets a tractor. How much will the farm's output increase? Quite a lot. In fact, probably way more than if the same tractor would be shipped to the US, where tractors are already abundant. This reasoning suggests that the marginal contribution of the same unit of capital is larger in countries where capital is scarcer. At the same time, it also suggests that capital enhances labor productivity. This, combined, leads to faster increases in output per capita if compared to other countries more capital-rich. Eventually, poor economies become saturated in capital, and GDP growth starts to slow down and converge to the same long-run trend developed economies exhibit. Now, if this is true, if poor economies would grow faster than rich economies, we should see a negative relationship between how rich a country is, say, GDP per capita in 1960, and the GDP's growth rate over the next, say, 40 years. However, when we do just that, what we see is that in fact no such relation can be directly observed, as we see in this scatter plot. This should not come as a surprise, because there are a lot more things that can also determine economic performance. Here, we are comparing Sweden with Rwanda, the US with Myanmar, Germany with Venezuela. These countries differ along many more dimensions than just the level of economic development. However, if we try to compare countries that are more similar, say OECD countries, then such a relationship exists. It seems that growth performances in the last 40 years of the 20th century conform to such a pattern. These are countries which are much more homogeneous in terms of policies, institutions, and other dimensions than the previous comparison, allowing us to have a fairer test of our hypothesis. We can take this comparison even further and compare the individual states of the United States of America. Now, not just over 40 years, but over 120 years. When we do so, we in fact find an even tighter relationship. US states that were poorer at the end of the 19th century were in fact the ones that grew the most over the next 120 years, conforming to the idea that being poor represents an opportunity for faster growth, at least during a transitional path to the level of economic development countries at the frontier exhibit. The reason why the first scatter plot we looked at didn't show the relationship between growth and level of development we expected is that, as we referred, countries in that sample had a lot of heterogeneity along many dimensions that matter for economic performance. First and foremost, differences in savings rate matter a lot. If you remember the mechanism, poorer countries grow faster because they are capital poor, and as such, capital is very productive and leads to a greater output. This unleashes a process of capital accumulation that leads the country on a convergence path to richer economies. If, and only if, part of that wealth that is created is saved and invested to produce additional capital. If the savings rate is very low or zero, very little or no capital accumulation takes place, and the economy stagnates. It is not by chance that most countries in Southeast Asia that experienced spectacular growth rates in the 90s had all in common double-digit saving rates. The average inflation rate also matters. In capitalist economies, the price system is a very important mechanism resources to be allocated to their most efficient uses. For example, an inefficient firm finds a hard time competing with an efficient one for resources because the latter, on the account of being more efficient, will be able to extract greater output out of the same resource and therefore will be willing to pay more. With very high inflation, this mechanism weakens. As prices are more volatile, at the same time, more resources are also wasted in accounting for inflation dynamics. Differences in fertility rates are also important. A very high fertility rate means that parents won't have the resources to provide good education and health conditions to their offspring. A very low fertility rate will lead to the aging of the population and increases in dependency ratios. Investment in education and health are paramount too, as educated workers are more productive and innovative. And a strong health system increases life expectancy, decreases absenteeism and participation rates. The size of government tends also to explain part of the relative economic performance between different economies, though the evidence is not overwhelming. Some people would argue that government production tends to be less efficient and lead to high fiscal burdens, putting a drag on growth. Another big determinant is terms of trade, that is, the value of goods and services and economic exports vis-à-vis the one it imports. For many economies, this is probably the biggest determinant of economic welfare. Think of developing economies where the extraction and export of natural resources are amongst their most important sources of income. If oil prices go down a lot, countries like Venezuela and Angola are bound to suffer a lot. How open a country is to international trade can also have a lot of weight for two reasons. First, if national firms produce for the international markets, there is a lot more scope for economies of scale. We will look into that with more detail by the end of the course. These economies of scale allow the country to produce more at cheaper prices, increasing their productivity and competitiveness. On the other side, it also imposes a discipline on domestic markets, since national producers face competition not just from local firms, but also from abroad, forcing them to be more efficient and well organized in order to survive. Lastly, property rights and democracy are fundamental for economic development. Even though the evidence on democracy is less definitive vis-à-vis some autocratic economies that have shown very strong and sustained growth for long periods of time, think of China for example, for property rights the evidence is overwhelming. Nobody will put effort into opening a business or setting up a firm if they run the risk of being seized or they have limited ability to enforce contracts. It is worth noting that when we correct the data to account for these factors, the initial scatter plot now shows exactly the pattern that we predicted. Poorer countries do tend to exhibit stronger growth than rich countries, conditional on a number of other factors that also matter for growth. This will be the motivation for our study of the Solow model, the idea of transitional growth and conditional convergence. But more on that later on. If you pause to think about it, economic growth and the understanding of its determinants is a key force to promote welfare for everyone. Robert Lucas, Nobel laureate, once said, "The consequences for human welfare involved in questions like this are simply staggering." Once one starts to think about them, it is hard to think about anything else. So far, we talked only about GDP per capita, but we know that the distribution of GDP is also important for people's welfare. It is therefore important to understand how inclusive were the progresses in economic welfare we observed in the past centuries. This figure shows the distribution of income across different groups of countries, from the whole world to subgroups like East Asia, Eastern Europe, or Latin America. To have a visual anchor, each of the graphs contains two vertical lines corresponding to annual incomes of $312 and $554. The $312 line corresponds to $1 a day in 2006. The $554 line corresponds to the poverty line referred to by the United Nations in the definition of the Millennium Development Goals. This line was originally defined by the World Bank as $1 a day in 1985 prices. This corresponds to an annual income of $554. We fast forward to 2006, and two things are of note. First, the decrease in the number of people living under the poverty line. The distributions moved to the right of the poverty lines, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty. The second is that the income distribution became more concentrated, with less dispersion, even though for most of the regions, dispersion actually increased. This means that inequality decreased in the world as a whole. The incomes of people in China and India, in comparison to the people in the US and the UK, for example, became much larger. However, within countries, especially in developed economies, inequality did increase. Regardless of that, the last 2 centuries mark extraordinary times and improves in well-being that were totally unprecedented in the world's history. Just note that in 1820, only 6 people out of 100 did not live under extreme poverty. Today, that number raised to 90. Only 12 knew how to read today. That number increased to 85. Back in 1820, democracy was practically non-existent. But today, more than half of the world's population live under democratic regimes. 43 out of 100 children would die before they reach the age of 5. Today, only 4 do. There is no doubt that the last 200 years were by far the best in human history, and we can legitimately hope that our best days are still ahead of us.